Scarlet and Violet's strongest Pokemon has disappeared. I don't mean that it was deleted from the game, but that competitive players have suddenly, all at once, stopped using it. But to understand why, you're gonna need a little context. This isn't the first time that a Pokemon has disappeared after all. It's not uncommon for a Pokemon to have a single appearance and then never be seen again. But what happened with Palafin is shockingly dramatic. Palafin is a pure water type Pokemon with a very interesting ability called Zero to Hero. When Palafin starts the battle, it's in its Zero form. It has all the same moves as its Hero form, but its stats are much worse. In order to get Palafin to transform, a player needs to send it into the battle and then switch it out again. Then, the next time Palafin enters the field, it will be in its Hero form, and it'll gain an insane amount of stat points. This mechanic is totally unique. There's no other ability in the game that behaves anywhere close to Zero to Hero, and it puts Palafin in a really interesting spot. On the one hand, its stats are so bad that it's a real liability until it transforms. Palafin almost always wants to start the battle on the field, meaning you're going to be ceding any hopes of being in the driver's seat from the get-go. And by switching Palafin out, you expose one of your other Pokemon to damage that they can't defend themselves from. On the other hand, Palafin, once transformed, is the strongest new Pokemon in Generation 9. But before we talk about that, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, Raid Shadow Legends. Here to get you up to speed on the new champions of Raid is Professor Death Knight.
Professor Death Knight here from Teleria University, who legally not a school, with a math problem. If you create a hit mobile game in 2019, how many champions will you have now? Over 700. Not only does Raid have hundreds of rad champions, it also has 15 amazing factions. Faction pop quiz. Can you name the latest faction? If you said the elusive Sylvan Watchers, you're right. Okay, class. Any questions?
Who's your favorite new champion?
I gotta say, Ultimate Death Knight. He's my #1 boy. I'm not supposed to have favorites, but I do.
Have you become friends with any of the new champions?
Well, I'm friends with literally every champion, but my favorite new friend is for sure Pythion. You ever been friends with a lizard man? Dude makes a killer quiche.
If you haven't been watching Raid Call of the Arbiter, which rock have you been living under? The limited series is well and truly underway, so be sure to check it out. There's also a bunch of brand new content in Raid Shadow Legends related to Call of the Arbiter, including a free legendary champion, the mighty Orc Warlord Artok. All you have to do to get him is log into Raid for 7 days between now and July 24th. Don't forget to keep up to date with Raid, Call of the Arbiter on YouTube. There's more awesome stuff coming. New players, use my link or scan the QR code right here and get a free starter pack with this cool in-game loot. Don't forget to use my link in the description. And thanks again to Raid for sponsoring this video. I mentioned that its hero form stats were better, but that's kind of an understatement. Palafin has the best stats of any non-legendary Pokemon in Generation 9. It has a higher attack stat than Groudon, Rayquaza, and Zacian Crown. It's nearly as physically bulky as Mew, has respectable special bulk, and is as fast as Zapdos. It was given a signature move called Jet Punch, which is a priority attack, meaning it moves before most other moves regardless of speed stats. To balance how strong moving first is, most priority moves are 40 base power, which is relatively low. Palafin's Jet Punch is 60 base power, 50% stronger than the already existing water type priority attack, Aqua Jet. Palafin was also given the new move Wave Crash, an incredibly powerful water type attack that damages the user. Add on access to the move Haze, a staple of competitive play this generation thanks to Dondozo, and you have an incredible moveset. Given what I just said, you might have expected Palafin to be on every team from the get-go. I certainly did. Prior to competitive play starting up officially, I made a list of the 10 best new Pokemon in Generation 9. And I put Palafin at #1. So you can imagine my surprise when online play began and Palafin was nowhere to be found. To add insult to injury, somehow the Pokemon that was in the spotlight was Murkrow, a Pokemon with abysmal stats, but that's not what this video is about. Why was nobody using Palafin? The short answer is, it's hard. Palafin is incredibly powerful, but only after it transforms. And because there had never been a Pokemon that was anything like Palafin before, nobody really knew how to approach using it. It didn't help that, in part because Dondozo was so popular, Meowscarada was on many teams and was one of the best Pokemon you could have against Palafin. But the real test would be the first official tournament of Scarlet and Violet, the San Diego Regional Championships. If anyone figured out how to bring out Palafin's full potential, it could lead to them winning the first major event of Scarlet and Violet. And a handful of players did bring Palafin to this tournament, almost all of them pairing it with Pelipper, Amoonguss, and King Gambit. Its highest placement was third, with a handful of other Palafins scattered throughout the best 64 finishers. For a Pokemon that was getting almost no play, this was a very good finish, and yet it felt a little lacking. Palafin is the strongest new Pokemon of Generation 9, and though its finish was respectable, it wasn't anything close to dominant. Liverpool Regionals happened a few weeks later, but Palafin performed even worse. Its highest placement was 5th, but it was used even less throughout the top performing teams, and was once again almost always paired with Pelipper. At this point in our story, it seemed that Palafin was only having success when paired with Pelipper, with the idea being that Pelipper's Drizzle ability, setting up the rain, allowed Palafin to be incredibly powerful offensively once transformed, at the cost of some defensive synergy. But everything was about to change when a player who hadn't used Palafin yet found an entirely different way of playing it. At the Orlando Regional Championships, won by yours truly. This team fundamentally changed the way the rest of the year played out, but ironically, it wasn't because of the Perish Trap aspect, which was the main focus of the team. It was because of my late addition of Palafin. Palafin, Arcanine, and Amoonguss were a core I used when I wasn't confident I could win with Perish Trap. And boy was it powerful. This provides a fire, water, and grass defensive backbone, which naturally cover each other's weaknesses, but that's not all. Arcanine, Amoonguss, and Palafin all have abilities that do something when they're switched in or out, with Arcanine lowering opponents' attack stats on switch in and Amoonguss recovering its health when switched out. On top of that, Amoonguss and Arcanine can use status moves, Will-O-Wisp and Spore, to cut the damage output of opponents, making it easier to switch around. And Amoonguss can heal its partner's health with Pollen Puff. All these factors combine for an incredibly effective core that balances the burst damage of Palafin with the ability to control the pace of the battle with Arcanine and Amoonguss. Once people started using my team and variants of it, they quickly realized the power of Arcanine, Amoonguss, and Palafin, catapulting it into being a mainstay of the format. And just 2 weeks later, Palafin won the first international level event of Scarlet and Violet, with an updated version of the Pelipper Palafin team that the player brought to San Diego Regionals. Most notably, this team added back Excalibur, which will be relevant in a little bit, though it didn't make use of Arcanine. And at this point, the floodgates were open. Winning back-to-back major events, the majority of the player base realized how strong Palafin was. The next major event was Knoxville Regionals, which was won by a player using 5 of the 6 Pokemon I brought to Orlando, with Iron Hands over Screamtail. This made 3 major events in a row won by Palafin. It's not that Palafin was the only viable team by any means. In fact, the next 2 events in Europe featured almost no Palafin in the top placing teams, and the next American event had Palafin's best placement at 4th. But this was just the calm before another storm. The Fort Wayne Regional Championships were going to be the first event of Regulation C, the rule set that introduced the 4 Treasures of Ruin. Nobody knew exactly how these new Pokemon would shake things up, but wouldn't you know it, Palafin once again ended up on top. Not only did Palafin, Arcanine, and Amoonguss end up winning the event when paired with Chen Pao, it also began showing up when paired with a more defensive Treasure of Ruin, Ting Lu.
No. Wait.
Palafin, Arcanine, Amoonguss, and Ting Lu placed 3rd, 9th, and 11th overall. But this event was literally the day the format changed, so it was possible that Palafin's success had to do mostly with what players were comfortable with. The real test would be the European International Championships 2 weeks later. Palafin, Arcanine, and Amoonguss placed 1st, 2nd, 6th, 7th, 10th, 13th, 14th, and 16th out of the top 16 finishers. The teams of the 2 finalists were identical, except one player used Excalibur and the other Roaring Moon. This was an unprecedented level of dominance for any team thus far this season, and it was at a major event as well. It looked like this team of Palafin, Arcanine, Amoonguss, Ting-Lu, Fluttermane, and one last Pokemon was going to be the team to beat for the rest of the season. Palafin, Arcanine, Amoonguss, and Pelipper won another major event in Europe, confirming this theory. But then, suddenly, Palafin just disappeared. It happened nearly overnight. Palafin's best placement at Portland Regionals was 7th, and over the next 4 major events in North America and Europe, Palafin would not place in the top 8 a single time, which brings us to the present. So what happened? How did a Pokemon that was so dominant over the course of so many events just disappear? It's totally unprecedented. Sometimes the opposite effect will happen when players don't realize how good a Pokemon actually is, and so it will suddenly spike up in popularity. But for a Pokemon that has been established as good to completely disappear, it's never happened before. While we can't say for sure, I have a few guesses. First, Palafin's drawbacks are very real. Even though Arcanine and Amoonguss support Palafin very well, that doesn't mean they eliminate all the risks of using it. And the more Palafin increased in popularity, the more players began finding ways of punishing the telegraphed Palafin switches. The addition of Ting-Lu helped delay this process because its ability Vessel of Ruin cuts the damage of all special attackers, giving Palafin another defensive tool to use while it repositioned. But eventually, players would discover counterplay. Second, with Palafin's continued dominance, players began discovering Pokemon that matched up well against the entire defensive core. The most notable of these is Gyarados, whose Intimidate ability, resistance to fire and water type attacks, and access to the move Taunt allows it to be one of the best Pokemon against this entire core. Gyarados' increase in popularity is paired with a steep decline in the popularity of Dondozo, who previously was one of Palafin's best matchups, as well as an increase in Amoonguss, which is one of Palafin's worst matchups. More niche is Orthworm, who uses Shed Tail to punish Palafin's inability to do damage early in the game, and uses the Pass substitute to block both Intimidate and Spore, often passing it to Dragon Dance Multi-Scale Dragonite, who can set up and sweep while Palafin teams desperately try to reposition to deal with it. Other metagame trends such as Terra Water Chi-Yu, Iron Hand's usage spiking, and the increase of Terra Water in general also causes Palafin to have less favorable matchups across the board. Lastly, players have discovered alternatives to Palafin for specific roles on their teams. Pelipper Rain is still around, but at present, players have been using Azumarill instead of Palafin. It is a bit weaker than Hero Form Palafin, but its access to Fairy's defensive typing, as well as play rough offensively, is very useful. Though the major benefit, of course, is that Azumarill doesn't need to switch out before it becomes strong. This allows these teams to save Azumarill in the back for the end of the game when foes are low HP, something that isn't really possible with Palafin. And that's the story of the rise and fall of Palafin, the strongest new Pokemon of Generation 9. With Regulation D and the World Championships right around the corner, it's possible that new ways of using Palafin have yet to come to light. All that's left is to wait and see if Palafin returns to Hero or if it remains a 0.